Hey, what's up, guys? I want to welcome you to this episode of Street Theology. Street Theology is really a place where we are here to help develop innovative reconcilers, bringing theology to a street level, encouraging everyone to think in a critical way about the world around them. And as always, I am joined by Cincinnati's finest, again, Mr. Steady Eddie. Like I said, he is the man. Listen, when you're playing a basketball game, you are the Klay Thompson of podcasts. That's the guy you throw it to. He's going to make open shots, make shots. Listen, one or two dribbles, not a lot of flash, but man, I tell you what, but super productive. Pastor Derrick Hayes.
What's up, everybody?
Pastor
Good to
Derrick.
be with y'all again.
How you doing? And then we are now joined back again with our experienced architect here. Expressions architect here. I messed that up. Expressions architect. Missions, all the things. Michelle Warner. Michelle, what's happening?
Hello. It's good to be back.
Glad to be back. And so we are excited here on Street Theology. Make sure, guys, you like, you subscribe when we have these. Make sure you share it. Also, give us a rating review, 5 stars. We always say we're 5 stars only. Okay, we don't like those. If you give 1 star, you are the people who thumbs down YouTube videos. And so I don't know. I have a theological stance on that, but I'm not ready to reveal that just yet. But guys, we are super excited today. Again, we have had some incredible guests on Street Theology, but I have been so excited for this guest for so many different reasons. We are privileged to have Pastor Steve Murrell with us. Pastor Steve is really, again, he is the president and leader of this Every Nation movement that we are part of. He is the founding pastor of Victory Manila. If you don't know anything, because Pastor Steve will not share this stuff because of really he is truly walks this way, but I'm going to share it, and so hopefully you won't be too mad at me later. But there's reality that Victory Manila is a church. Again, it is one church in 15 different locations. A church over 20 plus years ago, Pastor Steve and his wife Deborah planted. Again, kind of as he always says, an accidental missionary. Wasn't even meaning to stay there, and he found himself later. He's in Manila with a church of literally upwards of close to almost 100,000 people. Mm-hmm. Whenever they talk, and Pastor Steve just tells me it's the most casual thing. Yeah, we have 30 some odd services that are going on. I'm like, I have 4 and I'm about to die. And so there's 30 some services that go on, all the stuff they do. But more than anything else, he's an author. Again, he serves on the Real Life Foundation in Manila. But more importantly, again, he is the father. Again, he has 3 incredible sons, and I believe now he has 4 grandchildren. And again, he is 4 grandchildren, which is, again, probably the greatest title that he has as grandfather now. And so I can't tell you what an honor it is to have Pastor Steve here. Pastor Steve, welcome to Street Theology.
Adrian, really honored to be here. And what you may not know, besides 4 grandchildren, all 3 of my daughter-in-laws are pregnant right now.
Oh.
And yes, that was, we had hoped that would happen at some point. So one of them is due in the next week, and the other 2 about 6 weeks from now. So by Christmas time, there'll be 7.
Nice.
And so,
wow.
Life gets better all the time.
That is amazing, especially as a grandfather, because you get to do all the fun stuff and all the stuff you used to get mad at your parents for doing. Now you get to do that and then just pass them back, off. Huh?
I deeply believe that it is the job of the parents to discipline. So, that is not my role. I have done all of that I care to do.
That is amazing.
So I'm the good guy now.
And that's amazing. And one thing I will say before we jump in is I think, that I always admired about you, Pastor Steve, is the reality of that of a guy who works incredibly hard, incredibly dedicated to what you did. One thing I've always known is how hard you actually work. Traveling and all those things. But more than anything else is that you, again, as I watch you and your wife, again, continue to love each other and watching your marriage, but also raising 3 young men who actually really love God and actually have found their way and making real impact, in ministry space, business space. And so I just want to let you know, again, being a Jesus follower for 21 years, one of the things I do is when I get to see that, it's always an amazing thing to watch somebody who's works really hard, loves Jesus deeply, but still in love with their wife and raise really good kids. So I just want to commend you for that.
That's good.
Adrian, thank you. And I fortunately had a wonderful example. While I didn't grow up in a religious or Christian home, the 5 of us, 5 kids growing up together, I was number 2. There was no question that we were the priority for our parents. And my dad was an entrepreneur and started his own businesses and did quite well. But he always had time for us. He always made time for us. He was always coached our sports and was always deeply engaged in whatever mattered to us. He only came to faith late in life, just a few months before he passed away. But family was, no question, was a priority. And I was able to witness firsthand with my parents that being engaged parents and successful in career were not mutually exclusive, but that actually they go hand in hand, and that you don't have to sacrifice one to do the other. And so I'm forever grateful for that. I didn't get a whole lot of religious input there, but I certainly modeled a lot of what the priorities of a parent after what I was privileged to grow up with. So, hey, Adrian, I appreciate being here though. I thank you for what you do. I'm really grateful to be have this opportunity to talk to you and Michelle and Derrick. And you introduced Derrick as the Klay Thompson of podcasts. I know that I think a year ago they remeasured all the NBA players. Are you saying Derrick is actually shorter than he appears? Because I think Klay lost a few inches on that deal.
Hey, he absolutely did. He absolutely no. But I think with Derrick's steady Eddie. I tell people, man, listen, the one thing I love about working with Pastor Derrick Hayes is that when at the end of the day, you know what you're getting. You know what I'm saying? And the thing is, that works well with me and being as crazy as I am. So I mean, having somebody steady is really good for it and good for me. So
Okay, well, I think I must be the way you just explained that. I have a lot of crazy friends I do ministry with.
You do.
In the Philippines and here in Nashville. So I must be the Derrick. Derrick, you and I need to exchange notes at some point.
Yes,
see how we keep sanity working with people like this.
Listen, you guys are. It's like the guys that awesome. Steady, go, you got something, you're steady Eddie, just a plow, drop where we're at, let's get it going, let's keep it moving. You know me, you know how I am. I'm more like your good friend, Pastor Rice Brooks. You know, you get in the car with me, like I would say, you ain't got a destiny for your life, I'll give you one.
Well, a couple of years ago, Rice called me and he was downloading ideas, and then he stopped himself and he said, "Oh, wait a minute." He goes, "Steve, I've come to realize that I only need to give you one idea a week. I get about 10 a day." He goes, "But okay, I'm going to save the others till next week." So he's realized my capacity for new ideas and his are not even close. And so that's helped the relationship.
That is a great compliment.
That is a great, and with that, I mean, that goes right into this conversation. Again, you are, and I want to start with this, is that being the founder, I mean, you guys, founded this movement called Every Nation, which we are privileged to be a part of. But that thing, I mean, more than anything else that I've always valued about, and what made me actually stay and be a part of Every Nation, is watching those who are in front of us, like, stay together. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you, like, how do you do that? I mean, because, again, in a world today where we're connected more socially, but actually, it's what John Tyson says, it's the idea of the jet ski versus scuba diver relationship, right? Where we have, a lot of jet ski relationships. It's just on top of the surface, but really, you guys have really a scuba diver relationship. You have deep relationships. How do you do that? And you've maintained this for numerous years, and I'm really curious because how do you actually do that?
I've never heard that jet ski versus scuba dive thing. And Philippines has some of the most beautiful dive spots in the world. And we have some dive masters in our church. So my youngest son is a diver. So I dive with him. And that's an interesting analogy of the work it takes to go under, but also the danger. If you don't do it right, you can die down there. So if you try to go too deep without proper training, and if you try to go too deep without the proper equipment, it's pretty dangerous, more so than on the surface. But anyway, that's an interesting thought. But I think Adrian, I think the starting point is knowing, it's really knowing that God has called you to do something with certain people. Our mutual friend, Russ Austin, often says it's the mission that brings us together, but it's the relationship that keeps us together.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ministries that really have mission and they really do well. I mean, they're killing it in different areas of ministry. But as you've observed, I'm sure it's a revolving door of relationships. But I think it's both. It's when I think about calling, I kind of think in three terms. Actually, I'm writing a book right now, and I just am trying to get this down in a chapter. But I think in terms of the purpose, and I think for Rice and Phil and I and many of the founder generation of every nation, the purpose was crystal clear. 25 years ago, it was clear that God was calling us to do campus ministry and church planting in every nation of the world. Not random missions and wherever the door opened, but specifically strategic church planting churches that would reach the campus. Like you there in Tallahassee. I'm sure you guys do a lot all over the city, but you certainly do campus.
Yeah.
And when we start doing church planting, there's always not the back of our mind, but the front of our mind, reaching that campus. And so we knew the purpose, but when there's a purpose, there are two other parts of this. There's place and there's people. I was reading in my morning devotionals now, besides reading through scripture, I'm also slowly reading, I don't know if you've seen it, Christ Plays in 10,000 Places by Eugene Peterson. Everything about Peterson is a slow read. It's a few chapters, a few pages a day. And he was talking about the gift of place. It was his commentary on Genesis. I was reading this a couple of days ago, and it really impacted me in a time of gratefulness for the two places God called me to, the Philippines 36 years ago, and 12 years ago, Nashville. And now I split time back and forth. But with that place, I always had the purpose and I always had the people God called me to do it with, but there's also a place. And Peterson talks about how if we try to do theology or mission divorced from geography, create trouble. It leads to trouble. And the geography or the place, you're called to Tallahassee, and out of Tallahassee, you're reaching other parts of Florida and the United States and the world. God called me to Manila 36 years ago, and out of that, an ever expanding reach, and now Nashville. But I do think there's that when God put us together in every nation, it was a clear purpose. It was a clear, these are the people you're doing it with. But then there was also that place thing, that place in my soul that I knew I was in the place I was supposed to be, which at the time was the Philippines. Yeah. I know that relationships have challenges back and forth, up and down. And anybody who's past the honeymoon stage, metaphorically speaking, of any relationship, knows that they've had times and reasons and good reasons to cut it off and to move on and to quit. And not that that's never acceptable. Sometimes it is, if it's abusive or something. But we don't always agree, any more than I always agree with my wife. But certainly Rice, Phil, and our founder generation, we don't always agree. But we do agree to keep doing it together. And I think that's what's vitally important, that you know the people God's called you to.
Yeah. Pastor Steve, I'm wondering, I know a little bit about the story. I think a lot of our listeners, it'll be their first time kind of hearing it, because interesting, you talk about, people and place and stuff like that. You ended up in Manila, and I know that had a lot to do with you guys who founded this movement. Can you tell us a little bit of that story of how you ended up there in Manila?
I was happy as I could be in Starkville, Mississippi, doing campus ministry at what is known around the world as the Harvard of the South, Mississippi State University. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. I went to Mississippi State, and when I was 20 years old, the leader of our campus fellowship moved to Nebraska to plant the new campus ministry at the University of Nebraska. And he looked at me and he said, "Steve, you're in charge now." I had another semester and a half before I graduated. He didn't ask me to pray about it. He didn't ask me if I wanted to do it. He didn't ask me if I felt called to do it. He simply said, I'm moving to Lincoln, Nebraska to plant a new campus church. This is yours. So all 35 people. And I just said, okay, sure. So I did that for 2 years. In the meantime, got married. And then my phone rang May of 1984. I'd been doing campus ministry at Mississippi State for 2 years. And I really thought I would spend the rest of my life there, reaching that campus, building a church to reach that campus. At the time, Mississippi State had about 12,000 students. The town of Starkville had about 12,000 people. And I got a call from Rice. He said, hey, Steve, I'm going to plant a church in Manila doing a summer mission trip. Why don't you come with me? Okay, sure. How long? 1 month. So Deborah and I raised some money, called a few partners, flew to Manila, and we went from 12,000 at Starkville. At that time, Manila was 12 million people. And today it's the metro area is around 20 million people right now. And so it was another planet. It was another world for me. But 2 weeks into that 1 month mission trip, I knew this was more than a month. I knew I was supposed to stay. It wasn't, again, I never prayed about going. Rice just said, hey, would you go? I said, sure. I didn't pray about it. It was just pretty simple. Campus ministry shut down in the summer, at least at Mississippi State. So there was not a whole lot to do. Okay, I'll go on a mission trip. So Deborah and I went, but 2 weeks in, during a communion service on a Sunday on my knees, I grew up with a tough West Texas dad who taught me as a little boy that men don't cry. And so, and I may have been 5 years old and I would hear, hey, men don't cry. But wait a minute, I think I'm not a man yet, but okay, sure. So, but during that communion service, I didn't cry, but my eyes started sweating profusely.
Gotcha.
And, and what it was compassion for those people. And this outreach was going well and all these students were getting saved, but somebody had to stay behind and sort of galvanize this into a church. And I've always thought that, to me, it's like the need is the call. I didn't need handwriting on the wall. I didn't need a prophetic word. I didn't need any of that. It's like I looked around, there wasn't a long line of people saying, hey, I'll stay behind and help. So Deborah and I did. And we thought we were going to stay for a couple of months. That couple of months turned into 6 months, and then 8 months, and then a year. And it really, at about the 3-year mark, we realized, we might be here a while. So we probably should raise a proper partnership team, and we probably should, move some things over here. And, so it was sort of a gradual, growing on us. But like I said earlier, I am so grateful for the place that God put us. It's not a place I would have ever chosen, but I'm so glad God did.
Wow. That's so good. Do you have anything that you learned in the process, or anything that you would change in how it all started in the beginning, from where you were to the 12 million to how big the church is now? Like, what was the hardest thing about growing a church that big? And is there anything that you would go back and do differently?
Oh gosh, I would do a million things differently. Mostly the terrible sermons I preached. I would, on the good side, because Deborah and I never thought we would be there very long. Our mentality was to lead in view of leading. And so I think it was a good thing that we were sort of in a hurry to empower Filipinos, and we were in a hurry to give away leadership responsibility and give away leadership titles. And there was this constant empowering and equipping mode we were in, because again, we really thought we wouldn't be there long. But then after one church, we planted a second branch in '86, and then turned the first one over, and then planted another. Every few years we would just start another one. So we never really left like we thought we would. But when I go back, I think I was, early on, I was a out of control workaholic. And I was trained that way by my dad, who wouldn't tolerate laziness. And I took it to an extreme. I sure would redo that. It got to the point where my body just broke down. Deborah was pregnant with our third son. So that would have been in 1990, 89 to 90. And I got an amoeba which is pretty common in the Philippines, should be out for about a week or 10 days. But a couple of months in, I'd lost a lot of weight and I was really sick. Finally went to the hospital and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. So I've got a newborn, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and a growing church, and my body is rebelling. And finally the doctor, I don't go to the hospital really ever. I'm not a sickly person. I really, for me to finally go to the hospital, it was bad. And the doctor, I think it was the third doctor I saw, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. And he finally asked my schedule, and I told him my weekly schedule, and he just put his hands over his head and goes, have you ever heard of the concept of stress or rest? And so anyway, I had to change the way I did life in ministry. I radically changed it. I'd never taken a day off up until that point, never had a vacation.
Wow.
And so I changed, and Deborah and I religiously took Mondays off for the next years, until my son got into T-ball, and then I had a word from the Lord that we needed to shift our Saturday prayer meetings to some other time, because that was going to be my day off because I was coaching. So, but I would sure go back and redo a lot of that the way that I was. I think there's some things that I know theologically now. I have a greater depth of understanding of the gospel than I did then. And so I think there was some coming out of a shallow or a thin gospel. It's a lot thicker now in my understanding. So I think I have a lot more grace and patience now versus early on a drivenness because of a thin understanding of the gospel. So, and I guess that's just with time and maturity. I think everybody would look back, I hope, and go, boy, I've sure grown deeper. So I would, if I knew what I know now, and if I understood what I understand now, I would do it differently then. Of course, that's impossible. But I think the other thing I did what I would never allow someone to do now, and that is Deborah and I went on a foreign mission field with no support, really. It was before our ministry has a ministry of partnership development. We didn't. We just kind of had the idea of you go, God will supply.
Yeah.
And it was crazy. It was just foolish. And it caused a lot of stress in our marriage and in our just the lack of any solid, consistent income. That it was, even though the church was growing, because I was living on mission support, it didn't matter how large the church got. It had no impact on if you're planting a church, it's a struggle. There's a sacrifice. That's just part of the game. But as it grows, then finally there's a decent salary. But it doesn't work that way when you're in an international developing country and you're supported from the States. So the church could be growing and my income's going down. And so there were a lot of struggles financially, and which is one reason we've created in every nation the MPD system we have, because we don't want missionaries, campus missionaries or cross-cultural missionaries anywhere in the world going through what I put my family through in the early days. So I would surely do that one.
Wow. That's good. Pastor Steve, one of the things I've always, again, I've known you. I mean, I think the first time I ever, I think I met you, it was about 20 years ago, and it was through, ministry we had, Champions for Christ, and over the years I would see you, and you were just this guy. I would always see this shorter guy, black shirt on, bald head. And I used to be like, who is this guy? But he was always around, and you just, again, you walk into a room, Rice is bigger than life and all his personality and who he is, but you would just be there, and everyone, I'll never forget, someone says that, and I can't remember who it was, but they looked at it, they're like, yeah, that guy pastor is one of the best churches in all the world. I was like, that guy? I was like, he just, because you just were very unassuming. But here's what I've learned over the years of being around you, is there's such this security, or at least, of just knowing who you are as a leader. It's very self-aware as a leader. And what I mean by that is because over the years, I just see, you always say it, man, same boring strokes, making disciples, so on and so forth. Was that something that over the years you figured out? But one of the things I see with you is that you seem to always to know what you do well, and stay in that lane, but also really willing to empower others to do it without, the insecurities or the grasping for things. Is that just something over the years, or was that just kind of always there?
Adrian, I need to go back to something you said a moment ago before I responded. You said a short, bald-headed guy in a black T-shirt. I'm not short. I am 5'8". I am average height. There are some abnormally tall people, like Rice and others, that I'm around, but I am perfectly normal. So just wanted to make sure you know that.
That's fair.
And so, anyway, me and Clay Thompson, we're normal, or however short he is now. But for many years in the early days of blogging, you remember that way back when, when blogs were happening. I had a blog, and you had to have a title for it in those days. My blog was all about leadership, and it was called The Reluctant Leader, because really I almost every leadership position I've had, it came about somewhat roundabout, not something I aspired to. I really always felt I was more wired to be like an executive pastor, not a senior pastor, or like someone's support versus the other. So I ended up, when I ended up in the Philippines and stayed behind, I had to learn by sheer discipline and crying out to God how to become a vision caster, because I knew that was vital. But I didn't think that's really what I was. Left to myself, I was a line upon line, in-depth teacher, but not a motivational vision. So there are things I had to learn that I didn't think I was very good at, but I was desperate. I think being desperate sometimes forced me to do things that maybe gift-wise or just wiring I would rather not do, but sometimes the circumstance makes you. But it's leading. I'm comfortable with it, but that was never what I aspired to. It just wasn't. And even bigness, that wasn't either. Having a big church wasn't ever the goal. But what happened in the Philippines was that time I mentioned when I was on my knees during a communion service, 2 weeks into that new church, surrounded by a bunch of students who had just gotten saved, this compassion for lost people hit me. And I'm not an evangelist. I'm evangelistically challenged. I mean, but a compassion for lost people did something and changed me, where I couldn't leave, and I couldn't. It was a book I read that it's hard to even remember where I got the idea, and I didn't originate it. It came from somewhere else. But this idea that as long as there's one lost person on your campus ministry is not big enough. As long as there's one lost person in your neighborhood, your church isn't big enough. As long as there's one lost person in your city. And so what drove us wasn't a church growth mentality. It was a evangelism mentality, because if church growth is the driving factor, we could grow a big church and never get lost people saved. We just do kids church better, and then people come from down the road, or we have a better building or a better location, and all we do is just swap people.
Yeah.
But that was never it for us. For us, it was always this thing God did in my heart and the hearts of our young Filipino leaders, that we prayed for the lost. We would do anything to reach lost people. And it was the drive wasn't how do we get big. The drive was always how do we get the gospel communicated to people who are far from God. And if we do that effectively, we get bigger. If we get big without doing that, I don't want that. I have no interest in just getting big so that I can, prove to my parents I was successful. That's just not, that has no appeal.
Yeah.
But reaching people far from God, reaching people who don't know Jesus, that was the obsession. That was the thing that just gripped us. And not being an evangelist, it drove me to go, I don't know how to do this. I know how Rice can do it. I know how different evangelists that I was fortunate. You came there on a basketball trip. I mean, those things were amazing.
Yeah.
How many people would get saved because evangelists were leading that?
Yeah, I kind of want to stay on that topic just because it just kind of sparked some interest for me. Just reading some articles and things like that, it sounds like this generation, or should I say, like millennials, they almost, even if they're dedicated to Jesus, they find it almost, I don't know if immoral is the right word, but yeah, they almost think there's a sense of immoralness to sharing the gospel, and so I'm wondering, is there something that is that just a burden from God, or is there something that can be done to help generate that desire to see lost people come to know Jesus?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe it's different for everyone. And maybe what happened to me in that moment isn't really a pattern. For some people, it's more they look inside and realize what the gospel did for them, and they're motivated to go reach others with the gospel. For me, it wasn't so much that. It was, I grew up, I'd spent the previous years in a small town, a little college town, of 12,000 students plus 12,000 others. Now I'm facing thousands of people on the streets and buses going by and crowds. And it was almost like when Jesus had several times said he looked at the crowd and felt compassion. And it was more of looking at the pain. Part of it was looking at the poverty. Now, in the 3 decades since, the Philippines has really prospered. There's still a lot of poverty, but back in those days, it was devastating. I'd never been around poverty like that, so there was a heart for that, but also knowing ultimately the gospel is the answer. So, to me, it was getting around people who really needed the gospel in a very face-to-face way. But I don't know. I do think a good motivation is just looking at what the gospel did for us individually. That motivates a lot of people. But yeah, I'm not sure right now how people. I know there is a hesitancy with a culture that's turned against the gospel, not just the gospel, but anything that claims to be ultimate truth. That's kind of an issue in Western culture. It's not in most of Asia, not at all. That's not the issue, but here it certainly is. Rice's The Human Right speaks to that. If you've read that book, the ultimate human right is the right to hear the gospel and the right to know the truth. And I mean, Rice did a masterful job at laying that out in that third book of that trilogy, that God's Not Dead trilogy. So
that's really good. Kind of along the lines of this question, I guess, is where do you think the future of missions is headed in the gospel and taking that and going on mission, whether that's locally or being able to go back overseas? And how are you handling it being away from Manila in the midst of COVID? Like, how do you think that's going to affect everything that we do, even specifically in every nation with global church planting?
Yeah, Michelle, that's a huge question. And that's a question that I really pray and hope that everybody during this lockdown quarantine kind of world is thinking, how do I do mission?
Yeah.
Whether it's in a local campus, we're having conversations here about that. When some of the campuses are going to open up in the fall, some are not, but those that aren't, how do we do mission there in this weird world we're in now? And those that open, but we can't really do it the way we used to do, how do we do it? So I think that's a really important question. Let me give you a couple of thoughts about doing global mission and a couple of every nation stories, like mini stories, because I think whether or not this pandemic had happened, I think there are certain things about global mission that have been changing for a generation. 4 church plants happening right now in every nation. In Romania, Yujiro is Japanese from Tokyo. He is planting Every Nation Romania,
Mm.
Ujiro. He now, who would have ever thought that a Japanese would go as a missionary to Romania?
Right.
Speaking Romanian like a local. He lived there a portion of his life. Hansi is from South Africa. He is in the process of moving to Croatia to plant a church.
Wow.
Hansi's been one of our campus leaders and one of our leaders in South Africa. Rico, who I've worked with for 2 decades in Manila, is moving to Panama. Not Panama City, but Panama,
Yeah.
where the canal is. And he would have moved. He was supposed to be moving right now, but COVID stopped that. So hopefully in January, Rico and his family, his 3 daughters and his wife, and they've got a team. So here we've got a Japanese planting in Romania, a South African planting in Croatia, and a Filipino planting in Panama.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we think of world missions as basically Europeans or Americans, typically white Europeans and white Americans going somewhere where it's really poor.
Mm.
That's kind of the mission mentality, but that has been changing, where what we hope to see in every nation is that every church sees itself as a mission center, not just to reach their community, but their Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And I think that's a picture of what's happening in mission. And yes, the American churches will continue to be very involved in global mission, I hope. But we're seeing the church around the world being ignited to do mission locally. And also there's Saviwe. I don't know if you guys know Saviwe. He's from our Joburg church. Saviwe was a missionary at Every Nation Korea for years, went back to South Africa, Johannesburg, and now he was one of our key leaders in Joburg, which is a massive church of thousands. And he has planted in a township in one of the poorest of the poor areas in Joburg. He planted that quite a while, maybe a year and a half ago. And he spoke at, Adrian, you spoke about the basement a few weeks ago on our call. He spoke a couple of weeks ago, and fantastic, but he gave us an update about the church in this poor area. So that's mission as well. So we're doing a lot of mission, whether it's sending globally or sending down the street. So just when we think about what's the future of mission and global mission, I do think there's always local mission. The other thing about, there's one, I said I'd tell you 3, but there's one other one. We've got a brand new church in Burundi right now. It's been going for 1 year. Burundi is actually a little bit more than a year. Burundi is, if you look at if you Google poorest countries in the world, Burundi's unfortunately usually in the top 5. Some lists, they'll list it as the poorest country in the world, and kind of East Central Africa, and right next to Rwanda. Okay. They share a border, and Burundi has had a devastating civil war it's left people slaughtered based on tribal divisions. And there's a friend, his name, I'll won't say it with proper French, but Jean-Baptiste. He's from Burundi, but he spent about 6 years in the Philippines working, had his family there, and was a part of our church, working in a call center, making good money. But he moved back home a little over a year ago to plant the church, and it is thriving. Wow. It's just amazing what it's doing. And so I think a lot of missions will be that as well. There'll be expats who go back where they came from. Sometimes they're international students. Listen, your campus at Florida State, you are full of international. There's got to be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 international students from many restricted nations right there in your city. And my hope is that all across America will reach those international students, disciple them, give them a vision to go back to their people. The same way Jean-Baptiste wasn't an international student, he was an international businessman. But when he got in our church, after a while, he just said, I can't stay here in the Philippines. I'm making good money, but I have to go back to my people. Wow. And so that's what missions will look like too. I think there are people from all over the world here in America, business, students, all kinds of reasons. But it is my hope that our churches can become training ground to launch them back to their people as well.
Wow. Good. Yeah, I mean, Pastor Steve, we had a few weeks back, we had, I mentioned to you yesterday, and we had a chance to talk, Mark Sayers from Melbourne, Australia. And one of the things he talks about is this idea of what you just said of networks, of that how the internet has just made these networks where now before it used to be, like you said, the West, Europe, they just go reach these nations. But because, we've seen it even with COVID, where it's like, man, a global, this pandemic, this virus, gets from one side of the world to the other side of the world in just a few weeks. And these networks now, we're just so connected. But what he ultimately said, because he actually was telling stories about how right now in Africa, they're seeing a lot of people from China, because of building, the building that's been happening there, come to faith because they're finding themselves coming into African churches. So they're going to like Alpha courses, asking them for, asking for courses in Mandarin, because now you have these Africans reaching Chinese. And you just start to see it everywhere, and that's what ultimately I really feel is there, is that now the world's gone to where there's so much more networks, where we used to be, hey, you reach all this, but now it may be this type of people are reaching these people groups. And so, and one of the things we say a lot here at Engage is this idea of, we call it launching innovative reconcilers, but ultimately what it is launching the priesthood of the believer, that we really feel like we're in an era of where God is really doing that, where I feel like the church has had, and I don't think anyone did this on purpose, and it's not all churches, but where it was, everyone came and, and you served in the church and you did local stuff. But I actually feel we feel a real call here at this church to develop, equip people, to launch them into the world. And again, that's in business, politics, sports, wherever. And as they go, they tell the story. Yeah. And that's what we kind of feel is really happening in the earth right now. So it's really interesting to hear you say, just kind of hearing those stories of that.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about I love the way you said that. Would you say innovative reconcilers?
Innovative reconcilers, yeah.
I love that phrase. That's powerful. When I think about the church, and a lot of times we do think of the church in terms of the worship service, and we know the church is much more than that. Yeah. But that is a central part, and it's kind of been lost, despite having internet and all of that, but yet still the gathering has been it's put a lot of churches in crisis mode of not knowing who they are or what to do. But when you think historically about a worship service, and you think, let's go back to the bell tower in the center of a square in Europe. Mm-hmm. Any European city you go to, there's a square and there's a bell tower with a church or a cathedral, and that bell would ring. And that meant it's time to worship. It was a call to worship. And the Western churches have followed that. It's no longer a bell tower. Sometimes the organ starts playing, and that's clue. It's time to put down your donut and put your coffee down and get into the sanctuary. But that call to worship was a call out of the world into the presence of God for fellowship, to hear the sermon preached, to have sacraments together, communion, to pray with one another. And then it was a sending back to the world to do ministry. You're talking about the empowering every single person. And that's what church worship was. It was a call together to be filled, to be equipped, to worship, to meet God, to hear a word from God through a preacher, and then a sending back. Now, that changed in our generation. That was lost in Western church in our generation, where worship services were no longer a calling God's people out of the world together to be equipped, to be sent. It shifted to where, no, we're about people who are far from God. And so it changed the way church happened. Wow. It radically changed. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying it changed. Mm-hmm. And so then what happened is the equipping became very thin rather than a thick part of that service. And even the level of seeking God in worship together changed. But I do think what you're saying about that, at some level, this equipping and empowering, and then they go. And then if church meets on Sunday, that's fine. Then it's Monday through Saturday. It's out. Everybody's a minister doing ministry in the schools, doing ministry at your state capitol there in Tallahassee, doing ministry on the campuses, doing ministry in the doctor's office, and whatever it is they do. And then it's getting refueled on Sunday. It's coming back. It's meeting God. It's hearing a word from God. People don't go to church to hear from a pastor. They go to hear a word from God. And God has ordained that it's through the foolishness of preaching that his word is spoken. And then we hear that word from God. We worship, we get filled afresh with his spirit, and we go back. So it's church started with the bell tower ringing or the organ playing or whatever it is, our way of call to worship now. And then there's that moment, but the service would end with, now you're being sent back. Get back on mission. Get about your Father's business. We'll regather maybe during the week in small group discipleship. Maybe there's a training for certain type of leadership development throughout the week. Maybe there's this or that, but then we gather back to worship. We get refilled, refueled, commissioned, and we're back. It's that gather, scatter, gather, scatter, gather, scatter. But somehow in a lot of the church world, it's been lost a little bit, where we don't scatter anymore to do ministry because we think it's all done on Sunday, because that's when we gather lost people to hear the gospel, and then we starve the believers. It's so.
No, that's really good.
Yeah.
I'm probably going down a different trail than we had originally planned here.
No, this is actually really good, because again, and the reason why I really like you going down that and given even the historical context of what you said is because, we've been saying this a lot, even right before COVID. One of the sermons I preached was the fact of that, as a church, we came into our 7th year, and one of the scriptures God gives us is Exodus, 33, when God says that, we don't want to go anywhere unless your presence is with us. And then, and ultimately what we see, and what I really felt from God, that was the first word God gave us for our church. Like, God, we don't want to go anywhere unless you're with us. Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that, God says, he tells Moses, hey, I'm going to send you guys, but I'm not going. I'm sending some angels with you, but I'm not going. And the other thing was that, and what we really felt was that, in this time pre-COVID, was that God was going to be sending, but some people actually, and I think God in his church wanted to go because we became obsessed with the products of like of the promised land that actually is presence. Because he says, if I go, then I'll give you rest. And that word rest, we see it again in in Genesis 2, where it said, God said he rested Adam, which means he took up residence with Adam. They were in relationship, and that's what he wanted to do. And I really believe that we are living in a time where God wants to take up residence with his people, but I think it's going to be his people who literally are sending their people to the world, which again, for pastors, it's really hard because we don't have control. That's what's been the biggest thing. I think that's really, we have no control. Like we have right now. Is like and you know what, here's the thing. We really never had control. It's always been an illusion we had control. Now it's, it's what we've heard said, like, man, Sunday mornings, it's like playing chess and you just took the queen away. And now all of a sudden we're trying to figure out how to play chess without the queen, without Sunday morning. And I actually think it's one of the greatest things, because I actually think if churches are willing to embrace this, that this could be one of the greatest moves of God I think we've seen in our generation. But it's going to be those who are willing to actually send their people and let them go and teach their people the same God we hear from is the same God you hear from, the same God who gave us a call, the same God who gives you a call. And I think it's really important. But I think everyone's so, Pastor Stephen, I'd love for you to speak to this. So many people are just so wanting to get back to what was once normal. And I think this is just my opinion, I don't know if we get back to that. Not that we're not going to have large gatherings again or anything like that, but I think this idea of trying to get back to normal, I think that's a dangerous thing, because I think, God's doing something new. And so I don't know what you think about that, because it's really interesting, because you in Manila, you guys have been doing this for 30 plus years. Sending and just going. So this isn't going to be like for you guys. You've always done this. And again, but I'm saying here in the West, because again, you spend your time here in Nashville. Do you think that is true for his church, that God is actually kind of using this to shake that up?
Yeah, Adrian, I think so. And I'm our church in Manila is on a 26-week sermon series from the book of Romans. And so I'm following along, and I'm preparing a sermon for one of those coming up. So I'm studying Romans 8 right now. And in verses 9 through 11, 3 times the phrase, the Spirit dwells in you. The Spirit dwells in you. And then there's a different thing each time because the Spirit dwells in you, therefore, because the Spirit dwells. So 3 times the Holy Spirit dwells. And I think when we talk about people, non-vocational ministers, with little theological training, if any, that's who God uses, because the Spirit dwells within them. And if I can't put confidence in someone who the Holy Spirit dwells in them, that God can do something through them, then maybe I think that idea of empowering and releasing and seeing my job, God gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers to equip God's people so that they would do the work of ministry. And I think a lot of pastors spend a lot more of their energy ministering to people rather than equipping people to minister.
Wow.
And I think sometimes we spend so much time ministering to people we never equip, and then it's all the ministries down to what I as the pastor can accomplish. If I shift gears to an equipping mode, then I'm multiplying exponentially the Holy Spirit dwelling in someone. And let's watch what he does. To the COVID thing and not being able to have public worship, early on in this, I was on a phone with 300 of our Chinese leaders doing a Zoom call, all from 10 cities we work in China. And we prayed together. They asked me to preach a certain text, and then we did Q&A. And, for them, they've been through seasons of where they can meet publicly. It's illegal, but they can. And then it gets locked down and people get shakedown from the police and all that. And Beijing makes a decision, okay, no more meetings. And so the churches are all raided. One Sunday, 9 of our 10 churches were raided that same day by the police.
Wow.
And so we were talking about that, and they always have a contingency plan. They say, hey, when we can gather for worship, we will do it. And boy, it is amazing, the worship, because they don't know if they'll ever get to do it again. And boy, what a presence of God there. But they know that the life of the church are those small groups that are going on all over the city. And we never thought in Manila that there would come a time like this when we went 4 months and we couldn't meet publicly. We never thought that would happen. But when people ask me about the church in Manila, we're 36 years old right now. We just 36-year anniversary this summer. But the real key is when people ask about the size and all that, what matters is we have right at 10,000 small group leaders all over Metro Manila. And so that doesn't stop just because we can't gather together in the larger locations. Those people are out there in everyday life continuing to make disciples, because first it was on Zoom, but now the opening up was, at least in Metro Manila, you could meet with groups of 10 or less in social distance. So that played right into how we've been building for decades. And I think when a church sees that everything is about gathering as many people as we can, rather than making as many disciples as we can make, I think we miss the point. And so I think churches that are built around discipleship, that's empowering others to make disciples of others, and that multiplication thing happens, I think they're in good shape. And I hope that's the new normal for most people. A re-emphasis on making disciples in small groups, incidentally, the way Jesus did, making disciples in small groups. And he did have large gatherings. He certainly did. But the bigger the crowds got, you read, every time there's a crowd, you read a few more verses and he's back with the 12. It was this rhythm of this big crowd, this small group disciples. It wasn't just, okay, I don't have time for a small group anymore. I've gotten so big. Now I've got this giant platform. But it was always that tension of the big group and the small group of 12. And sometimes it was just the 3. So I hope we get to regather for worship sooner than later. I hope. But what I really hope is that churches that have realized they've got to do something other than that,
right,
which is small group discipleship. But it's the other thing that's been very encouraging for me, whether it's looking at Asia, Southern Africa, Nigeria, all across America, I have been so impressed by the way every nation pastors have been reaching out to the poor, because the lockdown has caused, as always, a crisis hurts the poorest more than it hurts anyone else.
Yeah.
And it's usually the people on the margins who start falling off. And I'm watching our church in Nigeria. I've been on the phone multiple times with our leaders in Nigeria. Their offerings went to zero because online giving is not a thing and they're not allowed to meet.
Wow.
But what they did is amped up their feeding programs, even with zero income. They reached into every kind of reserve and said, we have hungry people in our communities and we have to feed them.
Wow.
And so they actually ratcheted up their feeding program to the poor. We had similar situations in the Philippines, and I've just watched. I have been so encouraged seeing you talk about the creative reconciling, the creativity that's gone into how to serve the hurting and the marginalized during this time has been really heartening to me, and the creativity that's gone into it. It's been different in every city, but what they keep coming up with, every time I find another Every Nation church is doing this and that, I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
they really are being the hands and the feet of Jesus in those communities, which I think really pleases God.
Yeah. Again, I mean, and we have a couple more questions, and I want to respect your time. Again, incredible amounts of wisdom that you're giving. And I think, Pastor Steve, as we are, I want to shift a little bit because we are living in this moment here. And again, you saying growing up, in Jackson, Mississippi, growing up in a place where it really was kind of a heightened place of racism, in the history of our country, in Mississippi. But you are leading, what people I sometimes fail to realize, and I think even sometimes I fail to realize, like, the rare parts of growing up in this Every Nation movement of being so diverse. And you were leading a diverse movement as a man from Jackson, Mississippi that went to Manila. That's probably not when you're in Jackson, Mississippi saying, hey, I'm going to go here, or even one day leading this multi-ethnic movement. Kind of just tell me some of your thoughts, Pastor Steve, to our current cultural moment when we see that of race, and just kind of what you sense and what you feel, because I know it's a burden really in your heart. But kind of, just what you sense and feel kind of this moment, and what you see is really the response the church needs to make kind of going forward.
Adrian, I think, boy, that's a multifaceted question, because it's certainly here in America, we're seeing a real cultural moment that is dealing with a lot of history that's not been dealt with.
Yeah.
But it's not unique to America. The circumstances are, but the racial ethnic tensions, which has been odd to see, that what started with the George Floyd, horrible. Just the horror of that. But it was a bit shocking that then within a month they're having demonstrations in Germany, in London, all over Asia and Australia. But in Australia, it wasn't, that became a catalyst, but they're now going deep in the European immigrants and the Aboriginals.
Yeah.
And the conflicts that have been there and the injustices that have been there. And so it seems that, you can look humanly, or you can look at what is God doing. And almost everything that God does, there's a mixture of the human and the God. You just got to find what is God doing in this. And I think you do a great job of that. But it seems like there's something globally happening about ethnic tensions and ethnic issues. So there is a big picture of what's happening. And then to bring it down here, I did grow up in an all-white neighborhood and went to all-white schools and played golf at an all-white country club. And I grew up in a white world. I went to white prep schools, okay? And so other than seeing one summer job I had, actually literally digging ditches. My dad arranged the job for me to make sure I understood hard work. And I'm literally digging ditches with a pickaxe, putting in underground cables. I was the only white guy on the crew.
Wow.
I was the only one. So I'm 16 years old, and my whole crew are African Americans who are middle-aged. And the guy who owned the company was a friend of my dad's. And basically my dad said, I want you to give my son the toughest job that you have. I want him to understand to appreciate the education I'm going to give him when he goes to college. So it was an education, but it was the first time I was really around anybody who wasn't white.
Wow.
So that whole summer working with these guys, and it was eye-opening. One of the poverty, because these were minimum wage workers who were middle-aged raising families on minimum wage. I had never been exposed to that level of going to work every day with these guys. And now I graduate a couple of years later and go to Mississippi State. And we had a little fellowship of white guys. There were about 20 of us, Rice, Brooks, and some of the guys. And then this guy named Jerome Haywood, he was on the track team. He gets saved, African-American, and he moves into our house. He would come home with me on the weekends. And he visited last summer. He lives in Missouri now, but he came through. I hadn't seen him in years. And we laughed, we told stories, and that Jerome became my first friend who was not white. Now I worked with those guys on that summer job, but now I've got somebody who's actually a friend, who's actually, we would laugh, and it just. So soon after that, I'm in the Philippines. So I'm a white guy in a brown world, which was very different. And that was the world my kids grew up in. So my experience was, I think God taking a white guy like me who did not grow up with any diversity, sending me to the Philippines was kind of like him taking Paul.
Yes.
I don't want to sound wrong comparing myself to Paul. I mean, there's one Paul, okay? I mean, he wrote a lot of the Bible, so that's not, but Paul, who was ethnocentric, he was a Jewish nationalist.
Yep.
And going, okay, I'm not going to send you to the Jews. I'm sending you to the Gentiles, the people you hate, the people you look down on, the people that you think. And I mean, that's what God did.
Wow.
And that was kind of taking, certainly he could have found someone who had more cross-cultural experience than me, because that would have been almost anybody. But he sent me there. And some of it is probably to strip things off. Some of it is to get someone like me to the point where, God, I don't even know what to do. I don't understand any of this culture I'm in. I don't get it. I have no idea what I just did that offended that person. I have no idea. I don't, it was that constant. So I think coming back from that, when after living there for 24 years, coming back to America 12 years ago, I had quite a different perspective. But let me get to the point here. Being in Bethel, right here in Nashville, our senior pastor, James Lowe, James. James is African American. Our church here is probably 60 to 65% Black, but that's not all African American. There are a lot of African immigrants.
Yep.
So on Sunday, you'll notice the Nigerians with the colorful, so there's a large group of West and East Africans. Obviously a much larger chunk of African Americans, maybe 30% white. And then there's a group of Latinos, some Asians, different other ethnicities. And as you know, in a church that's very diverse, there's always tension points.
Yeah.
Those who are veterans and have been around for a long time, they've learned to navigate and to respect and how to have honest conversations and deeply listen. But there's always new people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've thought many times, I don't know if I ever want to be called a church that's mature, because I think when a church becomes fully mature, it means they haven't reached any lost people in a long, long time.
So good. Wow.
There's always going to be a level of immaturity, especially when it comes to racial tensions. While Pastor Brett is a dear friend of mine, and we have had deep discussions for decades, someone coming in new maybe hasn't had those kind of discussions.
Yeah.
And there's possibility for misunderstanding and offense. And what we have to do is not be frustrated at having to go back and repeat and go back through the same. I know Pastor Brett and I've had some conversations in the last few weeks of it was almost of okay, we've got to go back and have the same conversation again and again and again, because there's always new people coming to new. Not that the conversation can't go deeper in my soul or anyone else's. It's always going deeper, but there's some basic things that we have to be patient enough to walk new people through, and really listen deeply and understand the best we can. We'll never fully understand, never, ever.
Yeah.
But we give it our best shot.
Yeah.
And empathize and understand it. It's been interesting watching the next generation, watching my son, William, my son, and Justin Gray. Justin's the head of Every Nation Music.
Yeah.
Their daughters are best friends.
Yeah.
And they see each other at church, and so William and Justin have become friends. They do stuff together. They live close to one another, and their kids were in the same school and stuff like that. So they started a few years ago. I forget which situation prompted it, but it was another one of those national, I hate to even say it, there's been so many, I forget which one prompted that.
Yeah.
But they started not just their small group, which was always a combination of Black, white, Latinos, but they started specifically diving deep into racial and justice issues. And it got, in a good way, ugly. You know what I'm saying? It can get, because it went past the surface into some depth.
Yeah. And
I think that thing started multiplying. So I think through those discipleship contexts, there's been some really healthy, but sometimes painful conversations and acknowledgments and moments of repentance. And Justin and William came up with a thing called pause. Every time they lead groups in these racial conversations, they'll, at the end of it, they go deep in scripture and deep in their own experience. And then they say, pause. Here's what pause is, P-A-U-S-E. It's, P is search your heart for prejudice. A, search your heart for apathy. You recognize it, but you just don't care. The next one was for unforgiveness. And then the S is self-righteousness, where I think I'm better than someone else. And then the last one, the E, is ethnic idolatry. And so every group ends with, let's take 2 minutes and pause, and let's let the Holy Spirit speak to us about prejudice, about apathy, areas of unforgiveness, self-righteousness, ethnic idolatry. And when that pause moment hits, the Holy Spirit floods in, and then it leads to prayer time of repentance and confession and forgiveness. And it's been pretty amazing having a discipleship context to work on a biblically based discussion about injustices.
Wow.
So
it's amazing. Well, as we come to a close, Pastor Steve, I think the last question I want to ask you is, again, you have always been about the next generation. I mean, even, I know, you recently just went back and, Dr. Steve Murrell now, and you went and you did all the hard work of that, which again is me and your good friend Russ Austin said, we let all those dumb guys go out there and do all the hard work, and we'll just take all their information. You know what I'm saying? They spend all that time. And it's like we let those suckers go to school, and we're just gonna just glean from them. And so, but the thing about you did it because you literally, when I've heard you talk about it, it's always about setting this movement up for when the founders and all they're gone. And so you always have thought about the next generation well beyond your life. I want to ask you this question, like, if you're sitting there at the end of your life, what do you want to say to the generation coming behind? What would that be? And it could be in anything. What would you say if you're sitting there on your deathbed and you say, hey, this is what I want to say, and you speak to the next generation, what would it be?
Good luck. No.
So sad.
That's
Tragedy.
awesome.
Hey, that's That's a deep question.
That is, I mean, and it could be again. I mean, like I said, I believe, hopefully, like I said, that's 30 years down the line, right? But right now, if it was right now, like, what would you say, like, to the generation coming up?
It's actually way closer than that. But I will say this: I went back to school for a very specific reason, and it wasn't about a degree, but I went back at 57 years old because I have a group of 5 very close friends that once a year, it's not a ministry thing. We do a retreat together and kind of speak into each other's lives and talk about what you're saying, the future, what's going to happen next, and how are we going to ensure that we finish well. And at 57, I realized that I needed to figure out some things about post-founder sustainability. And so I enrolled in a Doctor of Ministry course at Asbury Seminary to study that topic for 3 years, every single day, researching, writing, and I learned some things. I also recruited, because I knew I would quit if I didn't recruit a team. So I recruited Delvin Pikes, Chris Johnson, Brian Taylor, David Houston, Manny Carlos, Noah Landicho, and Nixon Nong. So we were the Asbury 8. And we were in a cohort of, there were 35 people in the cohort, and there were the 8 of us that did it together. But the book I'm writing now is taking my dissertation. A dissertation is written for an academic committee, but I'm taking that dissertation and trying to make it a useful book for anyone in ministry. And the working title is The Leadership Runway. And a runway at an airport is only there for 2 things: to take off and to land. And people who are landing, one day you're going to land. You will have been out flying, doing ministry. It'll be time to land.
Yeah.
And we want to create a runway for people coming to the end of their ministry and a takeoff point for people who are. And so that's what I'm deep in right now, trying to wrestle with that, to put out, to help people land well and to help people constantly take off on that leadership runway. But the simple thing is this: I'm looking for a heart and habits. God tests the heart. God's looking for a pure heart. He's looking for a whole heart. He's looking for a non-anxious heart. He's looking for a soft heart. But there are habits that can form, and there are habits that can transform the heart. And so what I would look at younger leaders behind me and going, let God do in your heart whatever he wants to do, but you need to develop the habits that'll keep that heart healthy. Wow. The devotional habits, the worship habits, the serving habits, there are habits that we do that'll keep our heart right. So.
Wow.
That's good.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, Pastor Steve, hey, you have been incredibly generous with your time, and we really appreciate that. And again, for all those who listen, who are part of our Engaged family and beyond this, I say it all the time because it really means a lot to me. Growing up as a coach's kid, I learned very early on the reality that there's always those who go before you, and you're farther along because those. And I can honestly say, Engaged Church, that that we're here because we stand on the shoulders of men like Pastor Steve Murrell, men like Kevin York, who's been a part here, Russ Austin, and on. We stand on the shoulders that these men plowed away, and that we're better. And our job is to continue to plow away for the next generation that comes behind us. And so, Pastor Steve, we honor you. We really appreciate all your hard work and what you've done over the years to allow us, this next generation of guys coming up, to actually have a better shot at it. You guys came at it, and a lot of times you said you went to Manila just with hopes, dreams, and faith, and now it's man, we actually have a plan. We were able to you planted a church with nothing. We were gifted some resources when we planted a church and strategy, which you guys didn't get. So we're farther along, and we hope to continue this as you guys pass the baton off, that we continue to run well and then pass it off well. And so I really appreciate all your work that you've done over the years. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Michelle, Derrick, thank you. Enjoyed being with you guys. And Adrian, what you guys are doing in Tallahassee, I pray that God will multiply it all over your city, all over your state, all over America. And I pray that God will multiply, because what you guys are doing there is unique, and it has the thumbprint of the kingdom. You guys are there, and the growth you've seen so far is just the beginning, the foundation, and God's going to multiply that. So I really appreciate all that you guys do. Adrian, thanks for your leadership.
Thank you, sir. Until next time, guys, we will see you soon, talk to you soon. You'll hear from us soon on Street Theology.